Hello everybody, John Fenn here, supernaturalhousechurch.org, and once again talking about the discipleship process. Today, talking about the rich guy's nephew. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about the series of decisions that we make that have placed us where we are, and how God is not finished with us yet, and how we can make decisions that are wrong decisions, but in our hearts we're right. In our hearts we're trying, and we're trying to come back around to do the Lord's will in our life, and we stumble and everything else. But I just want to encourage you today, talk about the rich man's nephew. Now, who I'm talking about is John Mark. And John Mark is seen throughout the book of Acts, and also seen a little bit, of course, he wrote the Gospel of Mark, but if you trace his life, you'll see a series of character flaws, a series of mistakes, of just bumbling around, and yet in the midst of that, the Lord wove his will through him. And it's a real encouragement to us today, because sometimes we feel like, okay, Lord, what are we doing here? I'm treading water, whatever the case is. Or even if you're marching on and say, man, I know I'm in the middle of the Lord's will, this is what I'm doing. And confident in that, you can see that we're all human, we all make mistakes. And his life is a tremendous testimony. The first glimpse we get of a character flaw in John Mark, which is basically that he chickens out of tense situations, is when he wrote the Gospel of Mark. Now, when he wrote the Gospel of Mark, it was the custom of the day in writing to refer to oneself in the third person. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus is arrested, Mark chapter 14, verses 50 through 52 says that everybody left. And in verses 51 and 52, it says that there was a young man who was just clothed with a linen cloth, had just thrown a wrap around him to get to the garden and see all the commotion. When the soldiers tried to grab him and arrest him, they grabbed the cloak and he ran from them naked. He let go of his clothes. He just ran away naked. That's again Mark chapter 14, verses 50 through 52. And commentators and scholars are agreed that in the style of the day, John Mark was referring to himself. So he was the one who chickened out of that confrontation, that situation when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. The next time we see him is in Acts chapter 12, and we see in, I think in verse 5, also in chapter 12 and verse 12, where John Mark's mother has a large house where people are praying because Peter's been in prison. So we know John Mark's mom, whose name was Mary, was very involved in the things going on in Jerusalem in the early church, and John Mark was a part of that. Of course. In fact, church tradition says that John Mark was one of the attendants at the wedding at the Cana in Galilee. So he got to know Jesus very early on, according to church tradition. But he ran away at the Garden of Gethsemane. The next time you see him is in Acts chapter 13 and verse 5, when Paul and Barnabas head out on a journey to tell people about the Lord. And here's what's interesting is Colossians 4:10 tells us that John Mark and Barnabas are related. Depending on the translation, depending on who you talk to, they're either uncle and nephew. Barnabas is his uncle, and John Mark the nephew, or John Mark and Barnabas are cousins. But I'm going to prefer the nephew-uncle part of it. And it's interesting, here's another church tradition. The church tradition says that Barnabas was the rich young ruler. In Matthew, where is that? I'm trying to think where that is. I think it's Matthew 19, about verse 26, where the rich young ruler came to Jesus and then he went away sad. The church tradition says that was Barnabas, who later came back to the Lord, and we see him in Acts 4. Now, I'm throwing a whole lot of stuff at you, and I don't mean to be distracting in that, but I just wanted to share with you that you've got a very close family situation here between Barnabas and John Mark. You've got a young man in John Mark who has character flaws, that he runs away at the Garden of Gethsemane, would rather flee naked than be seen with Jesus. He goes with Paul and Barnabas on the first journey. In Acts chapter 13 and verse 5, it says he was their assistant to Paul and Barnabas. So he's got his friend Paul and his uncle Barnabas, and he's helping them. But verse 13 says they got about a third of the way in there, and John Mark left and just completely deserted them. So that's the end of Acts 13. Well, in Acts 15, in about verse 26, you see Paul saying, hey, let's go back and visit everybody that we did on our first trip. And Barnabas says, hey, that's great. I'll take my nephew Mark and let's give him another chance. And Paul says, there's no way I want to take him with us. It's dangerous. And there's no way I want to do this. And both men are right. Paul is right in that he doesn't want to take this John Mark, who's got a history of leaving them and a history of running away from situations, going back to the Gospel of Mark and the Garden of Gethsemane. And Barnabas is right in that he believes in the potential that John Mark has, and that's the focus for today. Is that there are people out there, as well as the Lord, obviously in this case the Lord working through Uncle Barnabas, that says, John Mark, I believe in you, I believe in your potential, I believe in what you can do, I believe you'll rise to the occasion. And so what happens is Paul takes Silas and goes off to Philippi, and Barnabas takes his nephew John Mark and he goes home to Cyprus. And then we lose track of John Mark for a while. And so we only have church history to go by in that. And you think, whatever happened to him? This kid runs away at the Garden of Gethsemane. He's there in the prayer meetings and everything with his mom's house and everything else. He helps Paul and Barnabas, and then he runs away. He's got this character issue. Well, that's like you and I. We have character issues. We have different seasons of life, different stages of life we go through. And we look back and we say, if we are honest of that job or this job or this church or that church or whatever, we look back and we say, man, we really blew it. I really messed up there. I gave people a reason to take the action that they did. I mean, we would like to gloss it over and say it was always their fault. But when we turn the spotlight on ourselves, we see that there are issues that we come back to time and time again in our lives. And it's like the Lord is bringing us back around to give us an opportunity to step up, to grow up. Just like John Mark. You see, the Lord won't test you with evil, but he will put you in positions where you can grow and develop as a person. Ecclesiastes 3:15 says this. It says, that which is today has already been, and that which will be tomorrow has already been, and God requires justice of the past. In other words, if you don't learn the lesson now, you're going to see it again. And each of us can go back in our lives and look at a common thread, a job, relationships, whatever, where we failed. The handling of money, the handling of relationships, the handling of a job, the handling of family members. And we can look at common themes that are just not our best day, you know what I'm saying, where we messed up or where we contributed to our own, ending of that relationship. And it's, for instance, I run into a couple salesmen. I remember one salesman in particular. He loved to be on the sales floor, but he hated the paperwork. And another salesman talked to me about how he loved to sell to people and everything, but he hated the phone calls. He'd have to make 100 phone calls, a week or something like that, knowing that maybe only one person would actually end up in a sale. He loved the sale. It's always more fun to operate in our gift. It's a lot more fun to operate in the gift, but the gift in Scripture is supported under a foundation of character, and that's the way the Lord looks at it, to develop the character through which the gift can flow. And so you may love whatever your main gifting could be, whatever it may be, but there's a part of your job, a part of your gifting that you don't like to do. I found that successful people are the ones who learn how to do that which does not come naturally to them in their job, in their relationships, whatever the case is. And it's like that with John Mark. He runs away from the Garden of Gethsemane, and yet the Lord brings him back full around and says, John Mark, you love to be a part of the action. You want to be in there. You were there at the prayer meeting. You were there at the Garden of Gethsemane. You want to be there with Paul and Barnabas. You want to be where the action is, but you need to develop the character, that the stick-to-itiveness, to stick with a tough situation, to see it all the way through. And so when John Mark leaves and Barnabas takes him back to Cyprus, we lose track in the biblical record of what happened to John Mark, but we know from tradition what happened. John Mark eventually became the assistant of Peter, and it was from Peter's lips that we have written down for us the Gospel of Mark, which was written in Greek, and it's the shortest of the Gospels and everything, but he wrote it. And it's an amazing thing that this man who failed his uncle, failed his friend Paul, who failed Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, the Lord had faith in him, and he brought him around to where he used John Mark to write the Gospel of Mark. What happened to him? Again, church tradition says he went back to northern Africa in Alexandria, and in the year 68, which was a couple years after Paul had died and after Peter had died, in the year 68, if I remember church history correctly, he was out telling people about Jesus boldly, this time boldly to a crowd, and preaching Jesus. And they got upset and angry, and they tied him to a horse's tail and made the horse run through the streets, and he was dragged by a horse until he was dead. And so we look at the whole progress of John Mark, and you realize that that young man who ran away in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that young man who deserted his uncle and his friend there on their first trip in Acts chapter 13, and who went away in failure from his friend Paul, but his uncle believed in him. He eventually grew up, wrote the Gospel of Mark, and died a martyr's death, being dragged through the streets by a horse. some years later. So what I want to encourage you on is this, that the Lord loves the process of discipleship. He's in it for the long haul. He's in it for the ages to come. And so whatever you're going through right now, look back honestly and take an assessment of, have you been down this path before? And if so, rise to the occasion, mature in this area, the same way the Lord gave John Mark time after time to grow up, and he eventually did. I believe that so will you eventually grow up, because I know I face things, that same thing, and you see a pattern and you say, okay, this is not going to happen again. I'm not going to go down this road again. And that's where you take the hard step, the difficult step, to do the thing which is outside the comfort zone, and you grow up and you do that which is difficult, and you mature and grow in the Lord in character and in strength. All right, we'll talk to you next week. God bless.